issue of cannabis has played a role in the discussions at the UNGASS, or rather how it has hardly not played any significant role in the discussions, and a little bit about the background. I'll have to probably point there, yeah. So to immediately start where this summit will end, because this is the only reference to cannabis explicitly in the outcome document that will be approved on Tuesday morning. And that's the first quote, but that is basically a repetition of earlier language about the need to reduce or eliminate the illicit cultivation of opium, poppy, coca and cannabis plant. So that's the only article where it's explicitly mentioned, but I would say the real, more important paragraph that has to do with cannabis, but where it is not specifically mentioned, is this paragraph that has been subjected to days and days of debate. And it reads, now we recognize that there are persistent, new and evolving challenges that should be addressed in conformity with the 3 international drug control conventions, which allow for sufficient flexibility for state parties to design and implement national drug policies according to their priorities and needs, consistent with the principle of common and shared responsibility and applicable international law. So, before the whole UN drug control system started, there was of course widespread traditional use in the south of the plant, in Asia and Africa mainly. But there was also in the north already, there were many pharmaceutical preparations based on cannabis. So then, when the single convention got approved in '61, that changed. Now it did incorporate several of the key control features of the already the treaties that were negotiated already in the beginning of the last century. But it did impose more obligatory provisions with regards to criminalization, several aspects of cannabis control. Cannabis was already in the 1925 convention, so that was the background of the fact that cannabis itself was included in the treaty. Important feature of the single convention is that compared to the previous ones, that it extends control to cannabis cultivation, and that it requires the abolition of all those quasi-medical, traditional, religious uses. And then, of course, it decides to place cannabis in not only Schedule 1, but also 4, which was meant to suggest that it does not have any relevant medicinal purposes. So the suggestion to countries was to prohibit as much as possible all uses of cannabis. An important question, without going into too much detail, is the fact that the WHO has never ever done a proper review of cannabis, and so the current inclusion of cannabis in those 2 schedules is not based on a scientifically founded recommendation from the WHO, which is sort of how the system should work. And that's something to come back on later on. Of course, after the adoption of the convention, traditional use did continue in several countries. There was also an escape clause in the convention itself, where several countries made use of transitional reservation to allow still for 25 years after the coming into force those uses. So for those countries it only had to end by December 1989, the traditional uses. There was another exception in the treaty that was negotiated by India, because India was not willing to accept also to abolish the bang culture, which is based on a drink made from cannabis leaves. And they hold on to that condition, otherwise they would not have signed the treaty. So up till today, the leaves of cannabis are not controlled under the 1961 convention. And in India, the culture of bang can continue unrestricted. There's of course also the certain continuation of not medical uses under the guise of lenient medical schemes, like in California, but obviously the intention of the placement on Schedule 4 to also restrict its use for medical purposes has been eroded more and more, and of course more and more countries now fully accept medical use. There have been several other more soft defections from the regime. The coffee shops is the most glaring example, but also now more recently the cannabis social clubs in Spain and other countries. But by now, of course, there is also the legal regulation that has started, and the first country to do it was Uruguay. So that brought up the question on how can that be justified under the regime. The arguments that Uruguay has put forward is that that they think their new policy have said that they realize there is a tension, and that we need the leadership and courage to discuss if a revision and modernization is required of the international instruments. So at least they are not fully shying away from opening the discussion about the tensions that it has brought with the international treaty regime. In the case of the US, and that also brings us back to the UNGASS, because one of the strong points of lobby from the US side for this special session, and can read the quote, that as a starting point it is essential that member states use the UNGASS to reaffirm support for the 3 UN drug control conventions. So that pressure from the US to keep that off the agenda from the start has in fact largely succeeded. Also the European Union has adopted as a part of their common position that a full reaffirmation of the drug control treaty system, and expressed a clear willingness not to put that in any way on the agenda of the UNGASS. Now the arguments that the US used, and I guess that has also come up in some of the other panels, but it's different compared to Uruguay's argumentation. They basically maintain that the US federal government, as state party to the conventions, is not in breach. The corner, in the provisional imprint. But what the main point that we are trying to make in that publication is that while the UNGASS itself and most countries indeed shy away from opening the discussion about possible reform of the international legal drug control framework, part of that fear has to do with exactly the same what was shown in the process of the negotiations of the UNGASS itself, that it is basically impossible at the moment to find a productive consensus if you have to really negotiate with everybody in the world, because the reality is that that consensus no longer exists. So if you start now to renegotiate, let's say, a new treaty to replace the existing ones, you end up in a similar nightmare situation as the UNGASS itself has come to be, with endless discussions that end up in the end in an unsatisfactory end result, which we will see also this week. So what we try to do in this publication is to show that there are different types of reform options, that we do think it is important to uphold basic principles of international law, that it's not a good thing to, we fully support continuing with legal regulation of cannabis, but we do think it is relevant for the international regime to discuss openly the tensions that that creates with international law, and we argue that there are different possibilities, that not all of them go through the necessity of reaching a new consensus. So we divided the options in four treaty reforms that apply to all signatory states that indeed require more or less consensus approval. Then the treaty reform that applies to all signatory states but that require only majority approval. There are also treaty reform that applies to a selective group of countries, and treaty reform that applies to the individual state. And we can't go now into the details of the options, but just to give examples. Now, of course, what I mentioned in the beginning, the fact that there has never been a WHO review of cannabis. Yeah, but descheduling of cannabis is definitely one of the options of reform, which
them with very little options to actually develop themselves, their communities, their market, etc. Being Latin America that region, the region that produces, that suffers the most the violence, that has for a very long time assumed the most costs of trying to suppress supply in order for other countries not to increase their demand and whatnot, it was very difficult to get a consensus of what to ask, how to ask it, where to ask it, and to whom should we address our concerns and through which mechanisms. So at the very beginning there was just these three countries calling for the UNGASS, and then these three countries decided that they needed more people on board, and so they went after the natural country that had legalized marijuana in 2013, which was Uruguay, and another country that was pursuing some domestic reforms that were very interesting in the field of the criminal justice system, which was Ecuador. And so the group of the original three became the group of the five, and then after these five countries came together and decided that even though they didn't share a common vision on cannabis policy, mainly because of Mexico didn't want to say that it was in favor of cannabis legalization, they agreed that drug policy reform was needed and that they needed to conform a bloc. And so they started looking for other allies. And we started finding some interesting allies in the Caribbean. That's how Jamaica got into this discussion with the countries from Latin America, how we got in touch with Trinidad and Tobago, and how we got in touch with the Canadian folks in the hope that Harper would leave office soon enough so he wouldn't make it to the UNGASS, which I celebrate happened. We started having conversations with Brazil, which was the biggest absent of the region. You know, like having a conversation on Latin American reform without having Brazil on board is just nonsense. It's utterly stupid, and it's definitely ineffective. So Brazil came on board at some point. Argentina for a little while they changed their drug policy director, and was this priest that was very, like feisty, that came to the UN, gave a magnificent speech, then they kicked him out of office, and now we have another president that is doing the exact opposite. But all that to say that for 3 years we worked really, really hard in creating this coalition of governments, of states, trying to think exactly how to reform the international drug control system, how to talk about cannabis without openly speaking about cannabis, how to talk about human rights, how to talk about the limits of the international conventions, and how to talk about policy innovation at the domestic level. We finally did create a group, and in last year, it was November, if I'm not mistaken, we had a meeting of 26, 23, it was 23, 26 states that got together in Colombia as to draft a first document on what is it we expect out of this UNGASS. That group was called the Cartagena Group, that involved countries from Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America mainly. Also some observers from the Americas, and also some observers from other regions. I believe we had one country from Asia. And that particular group started drafting a list of points, of bullet points, that to some extent were the minor battles that we actually won with this outcome document of this UNGASS 2016. And these very minor modifications are still important and nonetheless vital for countries like Mexico and the US and Canada and Colombia to continue this discussion on how to reform drug policies. And I will mention a very few examples. For example, Martin said the outcome document is a disgrace in the sense that it takes out this lack of consensus, the fact that the international system needs to be rediscussed, rearranged, the objectives and the metrics need to be reset, and in that sense, the UNGASS 2016 is a failure because the world neglects this reality of lack of consensus and the need to adapt drug policies to what's happening on the ground. But the positive side of that, I need to keep it positive, otherwise you cannot wake up in the morning and do what I do every single day. The positive side of it is that we did manage to get some important things in that document. One thing is, even though we recommitted to this utopic goal of a world free of something, it was not a drug-free world. It was a drug abuse-free world. It's still awful, if you ask me. I hate that paragraph. I hate to start a document saying we recommit to eliminate drug abuse from the face of the earth, but at least disabuse. At least it's not we're committing ourselves to eradicate drugs from the face of the earth, from the from the beginning to the end of the market. We got a mention in human rights. The fact that the paragraph that Martin read said all relevant international law implies that human rights are also there. I know I'm running out of time. We got human rights in there. To countries like mine, in which the drugs discussion had been actively used to undermine human rights, having a mention in there is vital. We got gender. For the very first time, the CND started discussing gender issues, the intersections between gender and drug policies. And that is a massive victory for the movement, but also for women around the world who are being most affected by drug policies and who are in the, in the forefront of drug policy reform. And we also got that amazing paragraph of flexibility, saying that within the treaties we have flexibility. We also hate that bit because it neglects the fact that this flexibility cannot be achieved through these mechanisms because it undermines other international law instruments that we don't want to undermine because of the need to reform drug policies. But it's still a proof that the consensus is out, that the world doesn't share a unified vision and a unique vision on how to address the problem, and that some domestic changes will need to be accepted if we decide not to commit to a review and to adapt the international system.
To even others, but to some people that is an issue, especially countries with fewer resources, frankly, to put into substance abuse treatment, even for the two substances you see in red on the left, much less dealing with currently illegal substances. The second thing is that public opinion, actually broadly speaking, is very interesting. Support for marijuana legalization, even in the European Union, and especially in this cohort of 15 to 24-year-olds, this is a 2014 Eurobarometer survey across the European Union, They asked that cohort, which traditionally tends to be most supportive of legalization, whether marijuana should be legal across the EU. And in the dark bars there, now the red bars, are the no's for most countries exceeded 50%. There's a few that are the Czech Republic and a handful of other countries, Austria, I believe. My eyesight's not so great without my contacts, but you can see that actually most countries, even in 2014, in the very sort of politically progressive European Union, that younger cohort was saying no. The majority of people were saying, well, no, I don't think marijuana should be legal across the European Union. And also even in Latin America, I think that tendency is also, you can see it, even in some countries that are sort of at the UN level moving reformist programs forward. You see a good number of respondents in these nationwide polls. Now, again, polling there can sometimes be a little bit less reliable. Just because it's not done nearly as often and there aren't nearly as many companies that do it on a regular basis. But in many countries, it's just not a very popular position. Chile is an exception, but even Uruguay, I find this very interesting. You're looking at over 60% of the population there opposes the idea, and about 60% in a fairly recent poll said they actually oppose the specific program that their government had passed. Now again, I'm not getting into the sort of why that is or what it means that those governments should do, but it shows that even countries that might be saying one thing at the UN are having a different discussion back at home. And it may also explain why the Uruguayan government has taken so long to roll out the purely commercial part of their plan. And so one asks then, well, why is that? And I think it goes back to something that Lisa touched on a little bit here, but really more in her talk earlier, which I agree with. I think, honestly, the Latin American public at least sees this as much more of a mix between public security and public health. I mean, here, we talk about, for us, I think in the United States, the debate is often between public health and this concept of individual freedom to use substances. The public security issue in Latin America is obviously much more of a problem. It influences the debate there much more. There are a number of people, I think, and this is a little bit more anecdotal, but it'd be interesting to see good polling data to see why people in some of those countries do not like the idea of drug legalization generally, not just with marijuana, but there are many concerns about the ability of state institutions in some of those countries to manage any type of large enterprise.